Assalamualaikum ji, welcome to another video of Profit Magazine. With the ongoing economic situation and the federal budget just around the corner, we have a thorough expert on the subject, a former Federal Minister of Finance and Planning, Dr. Hafiz Pasha with us. Assalamualaikum, Dr. Saab.
Walaikum salam.
Dr. Saab, we'll jump right into the conversation. मेरा पहला सवाल जो है आपसे वो ये है कि पाकिस्तान ने इस साल के अंदर, even after revising the revenue collection targets and imposing extraordinary taxes throughout the fiscal year and changing goalposts at certain occasions, even when they were asked by the IMF on their own accord, we are still looking at a very large budget deficit, almost comparable to the one of the last year. So in your informed opinion, how do we categorically move towards reducing this deficit in the upcoming budget, and at least looking at this particular problem?
We started the year, this current financial year, with a deficit target of 4.9% of the GDP. And you're absolutely right, we are going to be on the right side of 7.5% of the GDP. And why is there such a large deviation likely by end June 2023? The fundamental reason for this is the fact that the burden of debt servicing by the government on its loans has gone up disproportionately because of the huge hike in interest rates, which have gone up from 13.75% in June 2022 to currently 21%. This is the policy rate of the State Bank of Pakistan, and inevitably this reflects on the yields that we have to give on treasury bills and bonds in the domestic capital market, mostly purchased by commercial banks. This has led to a situation where instead of the target of 3,900 or so billion as the cost of debt servicing this year, we are likely to close the year with a burden of 5,200 billion, believe it or not. That is an increase of 1,300 billion, which is equivalent to an increase of roughly, with the GDP at about 85,000 billion, that will be an increase of roughly 13 to 14%, 1.3 to 1.4% of the GDP. So it would have gone up anyway from 4.9, if you include this additional cost of the debt servicing, to 6.3. Now, what is the explanation for that additional roughly 1.2 minimum percentage of the GDP? The other reason is the shortfall in revenues. We are seeing two major shortfalls. One is in FBR revenues, which have stopped growing because when we introduced the severe import restrictions on the LCs, the imports were so severely constrained, and 60% of our tax base and revenues is linked to imports. So that led to hardly 1% growth in indirect tax revenues this year, whereas the target was a minimum of about 18 to 22%. So there is a shortfall there. Fortunately, our direct tax revenues have done very well with a growth of 46% or so, which is unprecedented, but overall growth rate will be about 17 when the target was 22. So there's a shortfall of 5% on FBR revenues. And the other major shortfall is in petroleum levy revenues. Although we are charging 50 rupees per litre on high-speed diesel and motor spirit, what has happened is that the consumption of these products, due to the big increases in prices and the fall in incomes in Pakistan, in real terms, the demand for petroleum products has declined by 15 to 20%. So there is likely to be a 300 billion rupee shortfall in petroleum levy. And finally, it was assumed that the cash surplus of the provincial governments would be 750 billion. This year, we'd be lucky if we get 400 billion. So you have spillovers both on the revenue side, shortfall, and vastly increased expenditure on the debt servicing side. And that has led to a situation where, as you rightly said, the budget deficit this year will not be much smaller than the deficit last year, although we are targeted for a massive reduction from 7.9 to 4.9% of the GDP.
Sir, in that breath, how do we set up that deficit target for next year in the upcoming budget? Because as you pointed out, our revenue targets have not been met, or on the contrary, if we don't, the monetary policy has not entirely been in line with the fiscal expenditure and the fiscal policy. Like a lot of that is being and has been attributed to IMF in the past. That this is something that we had to do to get the tranche, and sadly, Pakistan is still not getting it. Like, how do we target all of this in the upcoming budget?
Okay, the first thing is debt servicing. And as I told you, that it went up from 3,900 billion this year, targeted, to possibly 5,200 billion, an increase of almost 1/3 on the target. Now the issue is what will happen to interest rates in the next financial year, 2023-24. Now, if we see the presence of a new IMF program after June, already the present IMF program is in a state of more or less suspension over the last 5 or more months. So that will come to an end in June anyway, as was the original agreement. Will we go for another IMF program for another 3 years after June is the most important question today, because given the risk of default, Pakistan will probably continue to need the umbrella cover of the IMF. If that is the case, then if the inflation rate continues to be in the 30s or even in the mid-20s, as is the case currently, it's at 36%, then the IMF will insist on Pakistan continuing to use interest rates as an instrument for stabilizing the economy, particularly in terms of investment and so on. So what will happen is that you will see a further increase in the cost of debt servicing from 5,200 billion. It could go up onto the right side of 7,000 billion. Huge increase. If that were to happen, that alone is about 6.5% of the GDP. And if you have a primary deficit, which is excluding debt servicing, of another 0.5% of the GDP, the minimum deficit target for next year will continue to be about 7%, possibly 7.3% or even more.
That's already higher than what
we're expecting. Yes, this is the whole problem today, that debt servicing is adding up to so much. And you know, one of the interesting side consequences of this enormous increase in debt servicing costs this year, as well as likely next year, is that now debt servicing exceeds by a big margin the net revenue receipts of the federal government after transfers from the divisible pool. What does that mean? It means that defense expenditure, salaries of government officials, subsidies and grants are all being financed through borrowing. And that raises issues of the sustainability of a different dimension altogether.
Perfect. Very imperfect, in fact. I also wanted to talk about the austerity measures that the government keeps on proposing, and how politically this will play out in the upcoming elections if they are to happen. What do you think is the right approach going forward into the next financial year? Do we follow a path that has already been followed, जिसके अंदर हुकूमत जो है वो अपनी सियासत बचाने के लिए या अपनी सियासत को कायम रखने के लिए एक ऐसा बजट अप्रूव करती है जिसके अंदर वक्ती तौर पर आवाम खुश हो जाती है, या फिर are we down to see some structural reforms, some privatization और इस तरह की चीजें जो कि लॉन्ग टर्म में पाकिस्तान के लिए फायदेमंद साबित हो सकती हैं?
The problem is that this government is presenting the next year's budget on the 9th of June, as they have been told. It takes 2 weeks for the budget to be passed. So it'll be hopefully the National Assembly with no opposition sitting there really. The budget is likely to be passed by the 24th of June. The issue is how long will this government stay? Now, this government has to leave in mid-August, as 5 years are over. And if it does, then really between 24th of June and the 18th of August, it has very little time to implement any of its proposed policies. So quite honestly, the credibility of this budget in terms of the reforms that are proposed, either on the expenditure side or on the revenue side, is highly, highly dubious. We will have to wait after elections for the next government, which is elected for 5 years and will then be in a position to implement the policies and reforms, and may wish to come up with a mini budget after the elections and change the direction of the budget for 23-24 completely. If a different government, if a different party is elected.
So having said that, what is one policy measure that you want to, something that you can say that that is necessary for this government to take in this very budget and cannot be waited for up until a new government comes? What is something that's absolutely necessary for Pakistan to do, at least at this point in time?
The problem is our black hole, which I call the black hole, which is the power sector. The subsidy bill on the power sector this year also exceeds the target. And it could be anywhere in the range of 750 to 800 billion or more. And our circular debt is beginning to approach almost 3 trillion. The key to successful management of expenditures in the short run is to limit the size of the subsidy to the power sector. Now, the government in its earlier discussions with the IMF had committed to increasing the power tariff by 7.90 rupees per kilowatt hour, but has only implemented 3.90 rupees per kilowatt hour. So the first thing they will need to do is to ensure that that happens, particularly if there is an IMF program after June. And that will certainly help. But the key in the medium to long run is to reduce losses. Pakistan's losses in the power sector, transmission plus billing, add up to almost 25%, which is one of the highest in the world. And this is a reflection of the extraordinarily poor quality of governance in the power sector. So that is one critical area where we have no other option but to take action if we want to limit the size of our deficit. The second critical area is that we have failed as a country to implement the wonderful 18th Amendment to the Constitution, which was adopted, if you remember, in 2009-10 by consensus of all political parties. It was a huge step forward, but as is always the case, implementation has been very slow and very weak. The key thing now is to devolve and devolve further. So all the common functions of the federal government and the provincial governments, and also the so-called concurrent list functions, which have been abolished, must now be fully, totally transferred to the provincial governments, who are in a much better financial position because of large transfers. And the second thing that the provincial governments have to do is finally devolve on a large-scale basis to local governments, which were recognized as the third tier of government in the 18th Amendment, and that has not happened. So these are the two big moves which are totally in the national interest and must happen immediately.
So do you think that makes a case against the NFC awards and in favor of revenue collection by the provincial or local governments themselves?
Well, you know what has happened is that the share was increased dramatically of the provincial governments from about 40% or so to 57.5% of the divisible pool. And that led to a situation where the transfers grew very substantially to the provincial governments. So they had very little incentive to develop their own revenue sources. You'll be amazed, provinces have big revenue sources, They have the sales tax on services. Services sector is 60% of the economy. They have also the agricultural income tax, which is a good 22% of the economy. They have developed neither. And the end result is that today the provincial tax revenues are just about 1% of the GDP. The corresponding number for the states of India is 6% of the GDP. That is the difference between our provinces and Indian states with similar fiscal powers.
So, yes, sir. Before we end this interview, I would like to ask you one last time, is it a fool's hope now to be relying on an IMF program or to be projecting the next budget with an IMF program?
Well, it seems a bit unlikely now, unless the governments come through with two things in the immediate short run. I think the discussions on the budget for 2023-24, the targets were already given as part of the revenue projections and budgetary projections by the IMF following the staff statement in the 9th review. So they will want to look at what the government is wanting to do in terms of the budgetary targets. Particularly the key targets are growth in revenues. We will probably, we are lucky if they go on to the right side of 7,000 billion this year. Probably the IMF would ask for a target of something like 9.2 to 9.4 trillion rupees, which is a very massive increase. Will the government come up with a well-defined set of proposals to achieve that extraordinary growth of almost 30%? Secondly, they will focus on critical sectors like the power sector. They will focus on the state of your expenditures, particularly on current expenditures, and in particular, most on subsidies and grants. And then the issue also is, given the inflation of 36%, which will average for the year as a whole about 30%, will the government employees be given a salary increase? Last year, they did not get a salary increase. So legitimately, you might see a situation where at least the lower levels of staff will go on a street agitation if they don't get an increase. So if the government has to budget a 20% increase or so in line with the high inflation, then that will add something like almost, if we include the salaries of the defense establishment, it will add something like 450 to 500 billion to expenditures.